Hello and welcome to all students and viewers, whether you are watching it on Facebook Live or whether you will be joining us later on. Thank you so much. We at the Center for Constitutional Law and Policy at Parul Institute of Law, Faculty of Law, Parul University, carry out a number of activities starting from research to discussion based activities, and we also have guest talks and expert talks every now and then based on various topics somewhere related to constitutional law. So today we have got a very interesting topic which has been there for some time now. Actually, that is the title of today's guest talk is Brexit, a never-ending story and possible constitutional challenges. So a very interesting topic and an equally interesting resource person we have got today for the topic. We have got Professor Patrick C.R. Terry, who is the Dean at Faculty of Law, University of Public Administration, Kiel. A very warm welcome to you, Professor. I'll introduce Professor Patrick. Professor Patrick Terry is the Dean of Faculty of Law and a Professor of Law at the University of Public Administration in Kiel in Germany. His main research interest is public international law. He has published in various international legal journals, among them the Harvard National Security Journal, the Georgetown Journal of International Law, and the Asian Yearbook of International Law. Previously, Patrick Terry was a judge in southern Germany for more than 9 years. He holds 4 law degrees, a PhD in public international law, and a Master of Laws degree in international law and international relations, both awarded by the University of Kent in the UK, as well as 2 German law degrees. His interest in Brexit results from his family ties to the United Kingdom and from having lived there for 7 years in the run up to the Brexit referendum. He has spoken on Brexit on a number of occasions in Germany and given lectures on the topic at his own university as well as his university's partner institution in Russia. So we are extremely privileged, sir, to have you with us on board today at the Center for Constitutional Law and Policy. Uh, Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me. I'll now hopefully successfully switch to the presentation mode. Yep. Do you see my presentation now?
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay. Thank you. Now, today I'll be saying a few words about the Brexit referendum and possible constitutional challenges the United Kingdom might face. First of all, as a reminder, we'll have a quick look at the results of the Brexit referendum, which took place on the 23rd of June 2016. And I'll have a brief look at the causes for the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the European Union before turning to the constitutional challenges and lastly, an outlook to the future with the many issues that still remain unresolved, unfortunately. Now, as a reminder, as you probably all know, a small majority of voters in the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union, a majority of 51.9%. What is interesting about the results, and which also has constitutional implications, as we will later hear, is that the 4 nations of the United Kingdom came to very different conclusions. So while England and Wales clearly voted to leave the European Union, Northern Ireland, and even more so Scotland, clearly rejected the idea of leaving the European Union. And that has led, as you can imagine, to many tensions since the result came about. Now, why did the United Kingdom decide to leave the European Union? First of all, it has to be noted that the United Kingdom joined the European Community in 1973, so it was a member for more than 40 years. And there had already been a referendum on Britain's membership in 1975. In 1975, 67% of the voters had decided to remain in the then European Community. Now, why that change of heart since then? I'll first explain how the campaign went. So what I describe here is short-term causes, and then I'll have a quick look at the long-term causes of the decision to leave the European Union. I think many people would agree that the main issue as far as the campaign was concerned was immigration. Why immigration? In 2004, 10 new member states joined the European Union, among them 8 former communist Eastern Europe and Eastern European and Central European states. Nationals of European Union member states have the right to freely move about the European Union. They can settle anywhere in the European Union and have an automatic right to work in other European Union member states. All except for the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, and Sweden, all the other EU member states suspended that right for the 10 new member states for 10 years. So if a Polish citizen wanted to move to Germany, he had to wait until 2014. The United Kingdom decided to allow that as of 2004. And this led to a massive influx of immigrants, mainly from Eastern Europe. For example, the number of Polish citizens increased from 60,000 in 2004 to 900,000 in 2014. And overall, the number of EU citizens resident in the United Kingdom increased from 1 million in 2004 to 3 million in 2016. Now, although these immigrants were easily integrated into British society, the social services were completely overwhelmed. There were not enough hospital beds. School rooms weren't large enough, classes became too large, doctor surgeries were overwhelmed. And this led to a lot of resentment among the local population. At the same time, in late 2015, the refugee crisis erupted, with millions of people from Asia and Africa wanting to enter the European Union. As you probably know, Germany decided to open its borders, and more than 1 million refugees came to Germany. Now, that, of course, did not affect the United Kingdom, but Germany at the time argued that these refugees had to be distributed among EU member states. Now, that never happened, but that was one of the arguments used by opponents of the European Union, whereby Germany would force the United Kingdom to accept hundreds of thousands of immigrants, and that was not a popular concept. Closely related to the immigration topic was the topic of Turkey's accession to the European Union. Decades ago, Turkey applied to join the European Union. The application process is stalled, and nobody expects Turkey to join the European Union in the near future. However, again, that was used by opponents of the European Union to argue that Turkey would soon become a member of the European Union with another huge influx of immigrants to the United Kingdom. The third issue that played a large role in the campaign was the issue of sovereignty. So many British voters had the feeling that it should be the British Parliament that enacts laws for the United Kingdom and not the European Union. Because, of course, in many areas, the European Union now enacts laws and regulations that automatically apply to member states or have to be transferred into domestic law. And that was a concept many British voters did not accept. As always, the economy was a very important issue, but that also cut both ways. On the one hand, supporters of the European Union argued that it would be disastrous for Britain to leave the European Union because the European Union member states were its main trading partners. 45% of all goods from the United Kingdom are exported to European Union member states. On the other hand, however, opponents of the European Union argued that Britain, once rid of the European Union, could return to its glorious past of a global free trader and would no longer be tied down by what was viewed as stringent European Union standards and regulations. And lastly, lots of promises were made during the campaign, mainly by opponents of the European Union, who argued that Britain's contribution to the European Union could be redirected to social services, especially to the National Health Service, once Britain had left the European Union. Now, these promises were blatant lies. First of all, the numbers were highly inflated as far as Britain's contribution to the EU is concerned. And secondly, leading campaigners of the Leave campaign now admit that this redirection of resources will never happen. Now that was those were the main issues of the referendum campaign. What are the underlying causes? Only if one has been in Britain in the years leading up to the referendum will one realize that there was a massive campaign against the European Union, usually by the media, by the press, which is completely dominated in the United Kingdom by the right wing. So the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, and were always strictly opposed to the European Union, and the Times was ambivalent. And they reported regularly on the shortcomings of the European Union and also fabricated stories. In fact, Boris Johnson, the current prime minister, was one of those journalists who was sacked by the Times for fabricating stories, among them about the European Union. At the same time, there was a vocal minority of industrialists and businessmen that opposed the European Union. They saw the European Union as a kind of socialist project due to the stringent standards as far as environmental protection, workers' rights, and consumer protection laws are concerned. And they said that we have to get rid of this socialist project in order to return to our glorious past as a free trading nation. Ironically, you found similar apprehensions at the left end of the political spectrum. So there were many people in the Labour Party who also opposed the European Union due to the stringent rules on state subsidies. So many left-wing politicians argued that these stringent rules on state subsidies had cost Britain thousands of jobs in the last few decades, and that if Britain were freed of the European Union, they could return to help preserve these jobs. Then there was a general dissatisfaction among the population with the European Union, some of it based on fact, some of it based on fake news. And generally, as we all know, politicians do not like to take responsibility. So what happened in the United Kingdom, but also happens in all the other member states, that if things went wrong, politicians tended to blame the European Union and say that was Brussels that made the wrong decisions. Of course, they always concealed the fact that British politicians, British civil servants, and British diplomats always were part of that decision process. So there were no alien people sitting in Brussels making decisions. And in fact, Britain was very rarely outvoted in decisions made by the European Union. And following years of austerity after the world financial crisis in 2008, people in Britain were generally very dissatisfied, and the referendum also offered a chance to punish what was seen as the establishment and the UK politicians who were generally perceived as being pro-European Union. And lastly, nationalism also played a role. First of all, in Britain, generally speaking, there has been a strong tendency since the 1980s, I would say, of a glorification of the United Kingdom's past, based mainly on Britain's stand against Nazi Germany in the Second World War, but also a completely uncritical view of the British Empire. And many voters concluded that actually Britain had always done much better when it was on its own. And that the decline of British influence was perhaps due to the UK's membership of the European Union, thereby confusing cause and effect, because Britain, of course, joined the European Union as a result, among others, of its declining influence, and it was not the European Union that caused the UK's influence to decline. And a new phenomenon that has erupted only in the last few years is the phenomenon of English nationalism as distinct from British nationalism. There's a feeling in Britain that in England that English voters are being patronized. That is due to two developments. Basically, of course, the decisions taken in Brussels, which is far away, but also due to the fact that England is the only nation in the United Kingdom without a parliament and a government. And so the feeling in England is widespread that English voters are being marginalized and ignored, and that has led to resentment also against the European Union. Now, having quickly outlined these developments that led to Britain's decision, I would now like to turn to the Constitution. First of all, I'd like to make a few general remarks about the United Kingdom Constitution. Many of you will know this, but just to make sure that a few basic things are known to all listeners and viewers. First of all, the British Constitution is unwritten and often described as unprotected. What does that mean? There is no unified codification of British constitutional law. Rather, the British Constitution consists of statutes, such as, for example, the Human Rights Act of 1998 or the Scotland Act of 1998. It consists of international treaties, such as the European Convention on Human Rights. It consists of case law, common law, for example, the decision in Entick versus Carrington of 1765 on the necessity of having a valid search warrant. And it also consists to a large part of constitutional conventions, that is, customs and traditions that are not enforceable in law, but nevertheless regulate the relationship between the various state organs, things that in other states would be regulated in the Constitution. For example, the role of the monarch or the role of the leader of the opposition is based on conventions or not on constitutional law. Why is the Constitution often referred to as being unprotected? In most countries, if you want to change or amend the Constitution, you need a specific majority in Parliament in order to do so. For example, in Germany, you need a 2/3 majority in Parliament in order to amend the Constitution. That is not the case in the United Kingdom. Parliament is free to amend constitutional rules at any time. Furthermore, it is not possible, as we will come to again when we talk about parliamentary sovereignty, it is not possible for courts to strike down laws passed by Parliament as being unconstitutional. Therefore, many people argue that the Constitution in the United Kingdom is unprotected. One of the most important principles of British constitutional law is the concept of parliamentary sovereignty, whereby Parliament is the highest source of law. And as I already pointed out, not even the courts can strike down laws passed by Parliament as being unconstitutional, which is a common phenomenon in other countries. For example, in Germany, it regularly happens that the Constitutional Court strikes down laws passed by Parliament as being unconstitutional. Furthermore, Parliament is free in repealing or making laws and is thereby not bound by a constitution. So Parliament is seen as the most important organ of the state. Then we have the aspect of European Union law and the European Convention on Human Rights. As far as European Union law is concerned, the role of that law is distinct, was distinct in the United Kingdom from other member states. That is due to the fact that there is no written constitution in Britain. Basically, if EU law is seen as possibly infringing on constitutional rights within a member state, it would be expected that the member state amends its constitution accordingly. Now, that process never took place in the United Kingdom because there was no written constitution, so that the EU law transferred into UK law, it automatically amended constitutional rules within the United Kingdom. That will, of course, Britain has now left the European Union. However, due to the European Union Withdrawal Act of 2019, all European Union law was declared to be domestic British law and can be amended in the future, but not many such amendments have taken place so far. So currently, as far as EU law is concerned, the constitutional situation is more or less unchanged from what it was before Britain left the European Union. Moving on to the European Convention on Human Rights, it is first of all important to point out that this has nothing to do with the European Union, although it's often confusing for the public. The European Convention on Human Rights is based on the Council of Europe, and the United Kingdom is still a member of the Council of Europe. And as I said, the Council of Europe is completely distinct from the European Union. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights is very important in the United Kingdom because it guarantees fundamental basic individual rights. and it was incorporated into British domestic law by the Human Rights Act of 1998. Now, why is that so important? Because there was no British Bill of Rights previously. There were no guaranteed individual basic rights guaranteed by statute before the Human Rights Act came into being. And therefore, of course, that has played a major role in British constitutional law. There is now a discussion in Britain whether the Human Rights Act of 1998 should be replaced by a British Bill of Rights. And many argue that would be a signal of national unity if such a British Bill of Rights were produced. However, many others argue that now, where there's a threat of disintegration of the United Kingdom, it would be wrong to establish such a national symbol because it might increase friction between the four nations of the United Kingdom. And lastly, another very important aspect of the Constitution is devolution. Before 1998, the United Kingdom was basically a centralized unitary state. Based on the Northern Ireland Act, the Scotland Act, and the Government of Wales Act, all of 1998, however, the nation parliaments were created in the nations, parliaments or assemblies, and national governments were created. So Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have governments and parliaments, and subsequently powers were devolved from London to these nations. The range of powers differed in each case. I think one can be safe to say that Scotland has the widest range of powers, and Wales probably has the least wide range of powers of the three nations that received powers. Of course, that also leads to the elephant in the room. What happened to England? England represents 84% of the UK's population. However, England does not have a parliament and does not have a government. It is the only one of the four nations without a national representation, and the problems that creates will be turning to shortly. Now, moving on from these general remarks, I'd like to address some of the constitutional challenges that Brexit has posed, and I'd like to focus on two aspects, and that's the concept of parliamentary sovereignty on the one hand, and the problem or the threat of territorial disintegration of the United Kingdom. So first of all, let's have a look at parliamentary sovereignty. The Brexit process has raised two issues as far as parliamentary sovereignty is concerned. First of all, the issue of the role of Parliament in relation to voters. The Brexit referendum, as we saw at the beginning, produced a small majority in favor of leaving the European Union. And according to the law that enacted the referendum, the result of the referendum was not binding on Parliament. Nevertheless, Parliament treated it as binding. The problem with that was that the vast majority of members of Parliament actually opposed leaving the European Union. So they were forced to enact a policy they had campaigned against and a policy they opposed. They had to vote against their conscience and against what they thought was right for the country. And that has, of course, raised the question of the future of representative democracy in the United Kingdom, whether Britain will sort of return to a clearer form of representative democracy, or might possibly move in the direction of what some people refer to as a more populist version of democracy, whereby voters, referenda, and the media have much more influence on decisions taken by Parliament. So basically, the question is, what is the relationship between voters? Can they actually force Parliament to take decisions it does not want to take? The other aspect, which is often discussed, is, of course, the relationship between Parliament and the executive in the United Kingdom. Now, before we talk about the ramifications of the Brexit process, I'd like to point out that, in my view, the supreme role of Parliament in the United Kingdom always was a bit of a myth and has become so, and had become more so in the run-up to the Brexit process. Now, why do I say that? For two reasons, a practical reason and a legal reason. The practical reason basically is that, as we all know, as a result of globalization, international corporations have become extremely powerful. And of course, the question that is raised by that is, can international business not force Parliament to take decisions that are in its interest? And I personally believe, given the immense power of international corporations, that in many cases, Parliament no longer has the option of taking specific decisions without risking losing massive investment or even jobs. That's the practical reason. The legal reason, I believe it to be a myth, that basically in Britain, the executive always was very strong. And that's due to the fact that the Prime Minister can rely on royal prerogatives in many areas, which therefore enables the Prime Minister to sideline and to bypass Parliament. The constitutional powers of the Prime Minister have never been clearly defined. And so, depending on the person who has that position, the Prime Minister can be extremely powerful. For example, it was often said when the United Kingdom decided to join the war on Iraq in 2003, that Tony Blair decided that with his so-called kitchen cabinet, which were a few advisors within Downing Street, and Parliament was only subsequently allowed to voice its opinion on the matter once fighting had already begun. So basically, I would argue that Parliament has never had the kind of strong position the concept of parliamentary sovereignty seems to imply. But now turning to the Brexit developments and their possible ramifications for the concept of parliamentary sovereignty. Now, there were positive developments as far as Parliament's role is concerned, and negative developments. The positive developments were basically based on two Supreme Court judgments. In 2017, the then Prime Minister Theresa May wanted to file the application to withdraw the United Kingdom from the European Union without asking Parliament, and wanted to rely on the Crown's prerogative in foreign affairs. And that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in Regina versus the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union decided that Parliament had to decide whether to file the application because the Crown's prerogative did not extend to rights enacted by Parliament in primary legislation. So that obviously strengthened Parliament's role. In 2019, Prime Minister Boris Johnson wanted to prorogue Parliament. He's not as usual for a couple of days, but for 5 or 6 weeks. His reason was that he had lost his majority in Parliament, and he wanted to avoid embarrassing debates and defeats in Parliament as far as Brexit is concerned. And he therefore advised the monarch that she should prorogue Parliament, and she did so. In Regina versus the Prime Minister, the Supreme Court decided that that advice to the monarch was unlawful, because prorogation in this case was merely meant to prevent Parliament from exercising its constitutional function as legislature. Again, another victory for Parliament's role and power within the United Kingdom constitutional setup. However, one should also notice that particularly the first decision was accompanied by a massive media campaign where the judges deciding that Parliament had to be asked were described as traitors to the people because they were not respecting the Brexit result. On the other hand, there have been negative developments as far as parliamentary sovereignty is concerned, and that is the role of the head of state. Based on the fact that Parliament and the executive do not have clear responsibilities under the Constitution, it was argued by some constitutional law scholars that any infringement by the executive on the rights of Parliament could be blocked by the monarch. So many said that just as in 2019, if the monarch received unlawful advice by the prime minister, and it was pretty obvious that the advice given by the prime minister as far as prorogation was concerned was unlawful, then the monarch could refuse to follow suit. However, it now turned out that at least the current monarch interprets her role more as a rubber stamp to decisions taken by the government. And that has weakened Parliament because it has removed at least theoretical safeguard against overreach by the executive. Furthermore, the decisions of the Supreme Court were based on a request for judicial review by an individual citizen. Her name was Gina Miller. Boris Johnson wants to limit the right to request judicial review, so it is not certain whether the kind of decision taken by the Supreme Court in 2017 and 2019 might still be possible in the future. And generally speaking, and the COVID crisis has shown this quite clearly, it has become, not only in the United Kingdom, but also in the United Kingdom, increasingly common to take decisions without asking the Parliament and justifying this on the basis of an emergency. So generally speaking, I would say overall, the role of Parliament is more endangered and the developments during Brexit have been less beneficial as one might have hoped as far as Parliament's role is concerned. Moving on to the other topic I would like to highlight is the territorial implications of Brexit, whether devolution will actually lead to independence. And there are very different scenarios as to the future of the United Kingdom. One is, of course, the disintegration of the United Kingdom. That is, that Scotland, Northern Ireland, and perhaps even Wales will leave the United Kingdom. How likely is that? Currently, we do not know. It is probably most likely in the case of Scotland. Scotland had an independence referendum in 2014. And in 2014, 55% of Scottish voters rejected the notion of Scottish independence. At the time, the leading proponent of Scottish independence, the Scottish National Party, argued that that referendum was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to decide on independence. However, they included a caveat and said there will not be another referendum as long as there is no material change in circumstances. Following the Brexit referendum in 2016, the Scottish government demanded a second independence referendum. Their argument is that there has been a material change in circumstances because 62% of Scottish voters rejected Brexit, and nevertheless, Scotland was forced to leave the European Union against its will. For that reason, the Scottish government says there has to be a second referendum. In May 2021, there were elections in Scotland, and there's now a pro-independence majority within the Scottish Parliament. And it is expected that the Scottish government will demand a second referendum in 2023. Generally, or originally, the government in London rejected the idea of a second referendum, as Boris Johnson at one occasion said that 40 years would be a good time to wait for a second referendum. However, more recently, there seems to have been a softening of attitude. Only this week, one cabinet minister said that there might be a referendum if the Scottish people demand it. The second issue is Northern Ireland. Based on the Good Friday Peace Agreement of 1998 and the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1998, the United Kingdom is obliged to call a referendum on the unification of Ireland should, presumably opinion polls, show that a consistent majority of voters in Northern Ireland wish to have a referendum. Given the fact that 56% of voters in Northern Ireland rejected Brexit, that is, of course, a possibility, especially since I would say the distribution between Catholic and Protestant citizens of Northern Ireland is changing. The demographics indicate that Catholic citizens of Northern Ireland will be the majority in the next 10 years. And lastly, Wales is probably the least likely to leave the United Kingdom. However, even there, we have seen an uptick in support for independence, due mainly to what was viewed as a very successful COVID policy by the Welsh government, health being one of the issues devolved to the nations. And according to opinion polls, support for independence has gone up from around 10% to now around 30% of voters. Of course, developments could also take a completely different direction, and Britain could once again become a more unitary state. And that was highlighted by the debates surrounding the return of powers from the European Union. Of course, the United Kingdom had transferred powers to the European Union, which were returned once the United Kingdom left the European Union. Now, initially, the government under Boris Johnson argued that all these powers should be returned to London, and that London would then decide whether to release certain powers to the nations. Mainly Scotland opposed that concept and demanded that as far as devolved matters were concerned, the powers returned from Brussels should be returned directly to the nations, bypassing London. At the end, a compromise was found whereby the powers returned from Brussels in devolved matters were transferred to the nations, bypassing London. However, London has retained a right of statutory return of these powers to London. So developments will show whether there will be any tendencies on the part of the British government to make use of this right of returning powers to the centre. Thirdly, some people advocated a compromise whereby the smaller nations, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, would remain in the European Union internal market, but also remain part of the United Kingdom. And that was a proposition mainly supported by Scotland and was rejected by the British government. However, as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, that is what has come about. Why is that? Based on the Good Friday Peace Agreement and the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and based on the fact that both the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom were members of the European Union at the time, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has been removed. There is no border. Now, the problem of recreating a border, now that the United Kingdom has left the European Union, is that everybody is worried that there might be a return to sectarian violence and terrorism, as in the decades before the Good Friday Peace Agreement, both in Northern Ireland and on the mainland. So everybody's agreed that there cannot be a new border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And it was very difficult to solve the problem. And basically, the EU and the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom agreed the Northern Ireland Protocol to solve the problem. And the Northern Ireland Protocol states that Northern Ireland is within the European Customs Union, but also within the United Kingdom Customs Union. And Northern Ireland is also obliged to align its regulations on goods with European Union rules. This has now led to a border in the Irish Sea. If goods are exported from England, Wales, or Scotland to Northern Ireland, they are subject to similar checks as if they were being exported to the European Union. And this has led to great resentment among some sections of the Northern Irish population that feel very British and that feel that this is the beginning of the end as far as the union between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom is concerned. And lastly, what about England? That problem has also not been solved. As I have pointed out, England is the only nation that has no national parliament and no national government. And one refers to this problem as the West Lothian question. What is that? The West Lothian question deals with the following problems. As far as devolved matters are concerned, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish politicians decide on their own. So their parliaments, for example, make decisions on the COVID regulations because health is a devolved matter. However, insofar as English matters are concerned, the House of Commons in London decides, as we also saw with the COVID regulations. And of course, there are Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish members of Parliament in the House of Commons. So while Scottish, Northern Irish, and Welsh MPs decide on English matters, English MPs do not have the right to decide Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish matters as far as devolved matters are concerned. There's no easy solution to this problem. Many have argued, why do you not create an English parliament and an English government? However, many also argue that that would actually strengthen tendencies of disintegration. Why? The English population represents 84% of the United Kingdom's population. If England had its own parliament and government, many worry that English voters might, after a short time, ask themselves, why do we need a second United Kingdom government? We can manage our matters on our own. So there might be a tendency this time coming from England to disintegrate the United Kingdom. There's been another solution thought of whereby a committee for English affairs is created in the House of Commons, where only English MPs vote on English matters, and the other matters are voted on by the whole House of Commons. However, that too is problematic. In those cases where there has been a Labour government in the United Kingdom, that Labour government has always relied on Scottish and Welsh members of Parliament for its majority. Labour has hardly ever won a majority of MPs in England. And this means that if there is a Labour government in power, that might lead to contradictory decisions, because the House of Commons might, in its whole composition, might decide one way, while the Committee on English Affairs might then decide exactly the opposite. Therefore, so far, that problem has not been resolved, and there's no ideal solution as far as I can see. And now I'm coming towards the end and pointing out to all the future issues that have not been resolved as far as Brexit is concerned. The first issue is Northern Ireland. I already pointed out that the Northern Ireland Protocol, the agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom on affairs in Northern Ireland, has caused a lot of resentment among the segment of population in Northern Ireland that is pro-British, and has led to riots and unrest. This has led the United Kingdom to threaten to suspend the Northern Ireland Protocol. This again has led the European Union to threaten countermeasures if the United Kingdom should suspend the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there are ongoing negotiations, and it seems that it is unsurprisingly very difficult to find a solution. Furthermore, the United Kingdom and the European Union have agreed a trade and cooperation agreement. However, this trade and cooperation agreement is subject to termination at any time with a one-year notice, and is also up for review within 5 years. Therefore, it is to be expected that many of the issues that were debated endlessly in the run-up to the conclusion of the trade and cooperation agreement will be debated again in the next few years. Fishing rights has become a flashpoint. Fishing is economically irrelevant to both the United Kingdom and the European Union. But for the United Kingdom and for France, it has become a very emotional issue. In the United Kingdom, this is due to the fact that fishing and fishermen were one of the main symbols of the Brexit campaign. There was a flotilla of fishing boats and fishermen sailing down the Thames in order to campaign for leaving the European Union. Only recently, the British Navy sent warships to the Channel Islands in order to defend fishing rights of British fishermen against French fishermen. The weak spot in the trade and cooperation agreement, that the agreement as far as fishing is concerned is only valid for 5.5 years and then has to be renegotiated. If one knows that the next general election will take place in 2024, one can imagine that this emotional issue will become another flashpoint and will again become a flashpoint. Then the next issue that has not been resolved successfully is the view of some British politicians, mainly among Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, of the United Kingdom as a so-called Singapore on Thames. Their belief is that if Britain slashes its consumer protection laws, its environmental regulations, gets rid of many of the workers' rights guaranteed by the European Union, they would be able to outbid and to outmaneuver mainly their competitors in the European Union, and they could once again become a successful trading nation. And that is a big worry for the European Union, and that's why the Trade and Cooperation Agreement includes an obligation by both sides to maintain comparable standards as far as the environment, workers' rights, state subsidies, etc. are concerned. And if there's any friction on that issue, a complicated arbitration system has been established. However, it seems very likely that there will soon be friction on that issue as standards diverge in the coming years. Trade has also not really been resolved successfully. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement states that there are no tariffs and quotas as far as trading in goods between the United Kingdom and the European Union is concerned. However, trading has become much more bureaucratic. If goods are exported from the United Kingdom or the European Union, they now need a proof of origin to guarantee that a specific percentage of the good exported actually is British or European. It is particularly bad as far as agricultural products are concerned, because in addition to the proof of origin, a veterinary certificate is necessary in order to export these products, and many small farmers and businesses have therefore stopped trading with the European Union because it's not worth their while obtaining these expensive veterinary certificates in order to trade with the European Union. And just to name two agricultural products, for example, the export of whiskey to the European Union has decreased by 63%, and the export of cheese has decreased by 85% since the UK left the European Union. And lastly, the issue of the City of London. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union excludes the services sector. And that means it also excludes the financial sector. Negotiations on the role of London in relation to the European Union are ongoing, and it is not yet clear when and whether there will be a result to these negotiations. There has been a negative development for the United Kingdom as far as the legal services sector is concerned. Prior to Brexit, I think that's well known, international business tended to prefer British courts if disputes should arise, and often mandated English law as the law governing agreements and contracts. And as long as the United Kingdom was a member of the European Union, judgments by British civil courts were automatically recognized in all the other European Union states and in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. And these judgments were also enforced. This is no longer the case since the United Kingdom left the European Union. The United Kingdom therefore applied to join the Convention of Lugano. The Convention of Lugano is an international treaty between the European Union, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, also guaranteeing mutual recognition of judgments and the enforcement of such judgments. And in the last 2 weeks, the European Union has, it seems, come to the conclusion that it will reject the UK's application to join the Convention of Lugano. That means in future, judgments by British courts will no longer be automatically recognized in other EU member states and will no longer be automatically recognized in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. So that could be a severe disadvantage for the legal services sector, for the many, many international law companies and lawyers working and living in London. And I've now come to the end, and I hope you have enjoyed the talk. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions.
So you have covered a whole lot of things in that 1 hour. So that is really exciting for us. It was like the way you broke up the intricacies of the United Kingdom on ground level. That what were the views of the four major components of the UK, and how does it work out differently at different places. That was really intriguing. Just had a couple of questions, sir. So basically, you talked about parliamentary sovereignty, which is kind of to an extent a myth as far as the UK is concerned. But a question which arises in my mind is that if the courts cannot strike down any law in the UK, then how exactly is the checks and balances carried out? So that's a question.
Yes, that's a very good question. Basically, the United Kingdom relies on tradition and custom in that respect. It is basically some of the things that are not done by the prime minister or by the monarch. For example, it is a convention that the monarch gives the royal assent to laws passed by both houses of parliament. Now, the issue arises, of course, if the monarch would not do so. There is no law stating that she is required to grant the royal assent. It is a convention. And only recently, in fact, in the second Supreme Court case of 2019, the Scottish government, the Scottish Attorney General, also brought a case against the Prime Minister, relying on the so-called Sewell Convention. And the Supreme Court again stated that conventions are not enforceable in law. So many of the rules governing British constitutional law rely on the fact that, I would say, everybody knows how to behave. And the problem then arises if you have a prime minister, as I would argue Boris Johnson is, who doesn't really care how to behave. How do you stop him? And that, I think, will be a big problem for Britain in the next few years.
All right, thanks for that candid reply, sir. And the next one is a kind of a general question, that in the long run, how do you see Brexit panning out in the interest of Britain?
It's very difficult to say. I would say in one respect, I'm pretty certain, and that is that it will diminish Britain's international influence. Because Britain's membership in the European Union served it well, especially as far as its relationship with the United States is concerned. The French often describe the British as the Trojan horse of the Americans, because the British themselves describe themselves as the bridge between Europe and the United States. And I think that role has been lost. The British are no longer able to influence European Union policy and are no longer able to mediate between the United States and the European Union. And I think that will diminish Britain's influence internationally. Economically speaking, I must admit, I'm not sure how things will pan out, because I also don't know what the development will be within the European Union. There are basically other tensions, of course. You probably have heard of the tensions between the sort of old member states and the new member states in Eastern Europe. There are lots of tensions with Poland and Hungary, and it's difficult to predict how that will pan out. And it's also difficult to predict whether Britain will be able to pick up on its traditional trading routes. I personally am skeptical, but I cannot exclude the possibility that they will be able to sort of rekindle these traditional ties they had before joining the European Union.
Right. Do you see any change in the role of Council of Europe post the Brexit?
Well, as far as the European Convention on Human Rights is concerned, there might be this British Bill of Rights, which replaces the Human Rights Act of 1998. I don't know whether the government might want to, especially the Conservative Party is always keen on removing foreign influence, so there might be that kind of pressure, although it would be very difficult to agree a Bill of Rights, especially with Scotland. Otherwise, again, the Council of Europe, I think that will remain in place, basically. But again, of course, we have these tensions, as you know, especially as far as Turkey and Russia are concerned, that they often do not implement the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, and they rather pay the fines for not implementing the judgments. And that's, of course, weakening the institution if member states begin to ignore it, the court. But I think it will probably continue in some way or other in the future.
All right. So thanks a lot, sir, for we have pretty much come to the end of the 1 hour. So thank you so much on behalf of the Center for Constitutional Law and Policy for taking out the time for us here at Palo Institute of Law. So it was a very intriguing session, and usually we at the center we do delve into the constitutional aspects of other states as well apart from India, but perhaps this is the first session in which we have gone into kind of depths of some other constitution, even though an unwritten one. But definitely there was a lot of productive insight. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Yes, sir.